in regards to colonialism, 500 years in the making, and how it has shifted through centuries due to late-stage capitalism, and larger implications not only here, but globally. How one people's struggle connects to another's halfway across the world. Now, before we get into the teaching itself, we wanted to take a second and commemorate one of our own. In the tail end of 2024, we unfortunately lost our dear comrade, Les. We had the privilege of having Les throughout years. I've never known a DSA chapter without him. We're also joined today, luckily, by our comrade, Dee Taylor, their partner in crime and spouse. Lester was a good musician, he was a great organizer, and even better than that, he was a great man. Above all else, Les was our chapter's mentor. In a movement in this city, our elders are one of our most vital and rare treasures. The work may be a little harder, our meetings may be having a little less laughs. They will definitely be shorter, but he would want to keep us going until we achieve the better world he envisioned for us. Today, I wanted to make a promise to our late great friend and to his family. I hope everyone will join me in this promise in your hearts. We will work harder, agitate rougher, and unify connections within our people. One of our struggles is all our struggles. Please, if you have a drink with you, or if you don't, raise your fist in solidarity for Les. Cheers to a better world. Let's go ahead and get into the presentation. We're first going to be speaking about the ethnic cleansing on Turtle Island. Our indigenous peoples have been leading the war against imperialism since Columbus invaded 530 years ago. Since then, there is nothing but atrocity after atrocity. But we did not just sit down and take it. We've been fighting since day one, and we will continue to fight. From the massacre of Sand Creek, where 8 members of the Cheyenne Council of 44 were murdered, to the constant breaking of Fort Laramie Treaty, to the nearly 300 innocent lives taken from us by the so-called United States at the massacre of Wounded Knee. We have been within the crosshairs of colonialism as they've attempted time and time again to wipe us out. Yet, as you see, we are still here, and we will fight for another 530 years if that is what it takes. Now let's talk about what we've done in response, revolt. Now, throughout our occupation, we've had made success in our struggle and had small victories through a spirit of agitation. An example of this is when we held the Rock, when a group of our indigenous leaders who held the moniker of Indians of all tribes rightfully regained control through several efforts of the island we call Alcatraz. We cited the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that deserted federal land could return to the Sioux. Quickly, they organized their community by electing a council. Everyone had a job, and everyone took care of one another, as life on Turtle Island was intended. See here is a picture from that event. Taking inspiration from our siblings in the struggle from the civil rights movement here in our backyard, and also in solidarity with the third world movements all across the world. Our people created the Trail of Broken Trees, where natives from the West Coast would travel to the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C., in order to meet with then President Nixon and other occupying governmental agencies to demand accountability for the years of governmental inadequacy. Now, in typical American fashion, all these agencies and the president were too cowardly to face up to us, the people. With the BIA against the cause, the organizers stormed and occupied the BIA building, starting from 500 warriors sitting in, grew to more of 1,000 of us, gaining control completely. When the police state came knocking, they barricaded themselves, forging Molotovs, breaking furniture, and fastening weapons from this furniture, and they completed a raid of the files, proving their suspicion that the BIA mismanaged their authority correct. Now, 83 years after the massacre of Wounded Knee, 200 Oglala Lakota tribespeople, led by the American Indian Movement, regained control of the Pine Ridge Reservation. In the efforts of combating tribal leadership corruption, they successfully lasted 71 days of reoccupation. After a firefight between the feds and the liberators, the government made another false promise for good faith investigation into their demands. Now, where the government fails, our people continue to rise up. The echoes of resistance still rings in the hearts and the minds of every revolutionary. From the Standing Rock mass resistance to the efforts against the Keystone Pipeline, to everyone in this room, it is up to us to repeat this spoken history, not only for us alive right now, but for the next generation of warriors. Now, whenever we fight against the government, whenever we reply, whenever they persecute us, they will always react as well. Two examples of this is how they treated two of our comrades. The first we'll be speaking about is going to be Comrade Leonard Peltier. Leonard Peltier is a hero in the struggle for Indigenous autonomy. After answering the call for protection by the good people of Pine Ridge, he was framed for the murder of 2 agents of the state. After a purposely mismanaged trial, a judge appointed by Nixon himself unjustly sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms. As you may have heard of the recent news regarding Comrade Leonard Peltier, the former president, Joe Biden, has commuted his life sentence to be served at his residence. Now, while we rejoice at the news of our comrade finally coming home, we must understand that imprisoning a man for a majority of his life and then sentencing him to prison in his own home is how they bring the carceral system not only in their jails, but to us in our own 4 walls. While we rejoice, we must understand that fact. We need to let it radicalize us. In this house, we do not celebrate half measures, especially concerning the freedom of our political prisoners by our oppressors. His life is the example of a settler colonialist project will imprison resistance leaders, even when they are the original aggressors. The second example we're going to be talking about is going to be Geronimo. Let's take it back about 100 years and speak about this, our martyr. A true warrior for the people, he was a proud leader and a medicine man. But unfortunately, colonialism altered what should have been a peaceful life. With a tenacity the size of 10 men, he fought for his people's right to exist on their land, time and time again. He knew a life confined to a reservation was not just for him nor his people. It took a quarter of the United States Standing Army at the time that finally imprisoned him at Fort Sill, where he unfortunately remained and was paraded around the country as a political prisoner. Now, as we're all aware, this practice of resistance being wrongfully imprisoned for their right to exist is not exclusive to our fight here in Oklahoma or the so-called United States. It is also happening in all parts of the world. I'm sure everyone listening in can name a few. We have one weapon to effectively combat this. History is full of examples of unity. One group cannot face the world of colonialism on their own. We must learn from our ancestors and martyrs and stand in solidarity with each other. Now, there is one group of people in particular that we will be talking about later today that need our help. But let's wrap up this section before we dive deep. As we see here today, the struggle of colonialism is over 530 years in the making. It has taken many different forms through atrocity and propaganda. Now, this is where we leave the question to you. Will you be like Geronimo? Will the organizations that we join be like the ones who took the rock? Or will we become class traitors? Growing up in the Cheyenne Arapaho countryside on the west side of the state, I was always told this one particular quote. Even Custer had scouts. One theme we'll be going back to and you'll hear it a few times today, is the decision is yours. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker as they draw the parallels between our fight here and in Palestine. Thank you.
Okay, hi y'all. My name is Aiden. I'm with OAO, Oklahoma Against Occupation. I'm here today to talk to y'all a little bit about some parallels between what we've seen in both Turtle Island and Palestine regarding ethnic cleansing and displacement. So I kind of have this laid out as like a side-by-side situation, and then I've got some maps for you. So we're gonna start with the so-called United States. In 1607, white European settlers established the first British colony in what is now called New England, claiming the land as property of the British Crown. This would bring a massive influx of settlers who Great Britain promised more land to in Turtle Island. And then I've got a picture of the 13 colonies here, Spanish, Florida, and then we'll come back to the French situation later. And then similarly in Palestine, Britain, as I think everyone here knows, has their hands in a lot of places across the world. And colonization of Palestine by Jewish settlers actually began in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But then in 1917, Great Britain came in and claimed all of historic Palestine as its own property. In 1917, Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, as well as the British Mandate. The Balfour Declaration was where they claimed all of historic Palestine as their own, but the British Mandate was where they promised the Jewish settlers within Palestine their own state for the first time. The next kind of big parallel that I see going on between Turtle Island and Palestine is the selling and splitting up of lands. In Turtle Island, obviously, we might have started as a collection of settlements and quote-unquote colonies, but after the colonies revolted against the crown and became a country, many set their eyes on further colonization. In 1803, the U.S. government quote-unquote purchased a large portion of North America from the French, known as the Louisiana Purchase. The French had claimed to own it, even though it was obviously already occupied. And this was basically just taken as a green flag by white settlers to begin further settling west, killing and displacing as they went. Similarly, in Palestine. So the entire time, so we talked a little bit previously about like the late 1800s and 1900s, and then the early 1910s, 1917. Moving forward a little bit, this entire time there was just more settlers coming in. And then in 1945, World War II ends, and Great Britain decides to hand over control of Palestine to the United Nations. So in 1947, 2 years later, the UN decides that they're going to split historic Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, despite the fact that Jewish people only make up 30% or less of the population. Yeah, that's the 1947 partition plan. So we have this kind of similar idea here with this, especially where it's like you have a bunch of settlers that make up like a very small percent of the population, and they give them like 55% of the land mass of Palestine. So this is something that I would compare to like how even after the Louisiana quote-unquote purchase, they would carve out Oklahoma as quote-unquote Indian territory and say that this was going to be the land set aside for indigenous people. And in the same way, the UN decided that they're going to make this one little area that's like a Jewish, or an Arab state, and make all of the Palestinians move to that area. So moving forward a little bit, I wanted to talk about just the ethnic cleansing and removal aspect, getting right into it. So in Turtle Island in 1830, the so-called United States passed the Indian Removal Act, which jump-started the ethnic cleansing of indigenous people living in areas close to settlements and eventually all across the so-called United States. The government would form quote-unquote treaties with different groups of people, manipulating them and making false promises, as well as using violence to forcibly displace them further west into what is now called Oklahoma, as well as reservations. During the Trail of Tears, indigenous people were forced to walk on foot with what they could carry to Oklahoma, or were forcibly relocated, with tens of thousands dying in the journey alone. This is sometimes compared to, in Palestine, what happened in 1948, which was after the UN divided Palestine into 2 states. In 1948, a massive ethnic cleansing known as the Nakba began, in which Jewish settlers, including some in militias, began attacking villages, slaughtering Palestinians, seizing homes, and displacing between 700 and 800,000 people out of their ancestral homelands and into small pockets of land. Some were also forced out of Palestine and into neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Hundreds of entire towns are destroyed. People end up being forced to flee on foot with nothing but the clothes on their back and what they can carry. And in both cases, of both Turtle Island and Palestine, some people argue that the ethnic cleansing has ended, but I think there's a strong argument to be made that it's not ended in both places. And then, okay, so the last thing that I really wanted to touch on, big parallel between the history of Palestine and Turtle Island is just more land loss, even after the mass ethnic cleansing. So in North America, in 1889, the so-called United States announced that the lands previously set aside for indigenous people were now open for settlement by white settlers. This led to another wave of violence against indigenous people as white settlers quickly moved into the lands that indigenous people had just been quote-unquote removed to. Just 1 year later, the massacre at Wounded Knee would take place, in which U.S. soldiers slaughtered hundreds of Lakota people on a reservation. And then in my mind, I kind of compare this to the Six-Day War in 1967. So at this point, most of the Palestinians have already been forced into like very small pieces of land. At this point, it's already mostly just what we now call like the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But then in 1967, Israel actually seizes the rest of the Palestinian territory as their own, meaning they put Gaza and the West Bank under military law. They also seize East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and all of that is quote-unquote Israeli territory to this day. And then I've got a couple of maps here. I've got showing some land loss. Obviously, it should start with the whole map being colored in, but I couldn't find a really good one, so I found this one that starts with 1850 for the Turtle Island. And then this one is for Palestine. So if you remember a little while ago, we were talking about, if you see over here, the West Bank used to be a lot bigger, and then after 1967, it becomes like kind of all chopped up, and now it's just kind of little pieces. Okay, I think that's it for me. Thank you guys.
Good evening, my name is Ed. I'm also an organizer of Oklahomans Against Occupation. And I'm just basically going to be piggybacking off of what Aiden presented and giving a very specific example of how ethnic cleansing and colonialism was facilitated and organized in the case of Palestine. So just a reminder of the partition plan, but even before that, the Zionist movement, they sought to establish their own state in the land of historic Palestine. And they did so from the late 1800s into the early 1900s when they started building settlements. And eventually, fast forward 1947, the British mandate ended, and they gave the issue over to the newly founded United Nations in order to come up with a solution, how to distribute and divide up the land. And so they came up with this partition plan, which gave the majority of Palestinian land to the new Jewish state that was proposed, and gave the minority of the land to the majority of the people living there, which were the Palestinian people. And so obviously this was rejected outright by the Palestinian leadership on the grounds that the Palestinian people should not be forced to give up more than half of their country and forfeit their national aspirations. But now I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about how, in order to achieve this goal of building settlements and establishing this new state on top of an already existing people, they needed financial backing. They needed some sort of way to facilitate this land theft and ethnic cleansing. And so this was primarily done, especially in the early 1900s, by an organization called the Jewish National Fund. Who here went to the Jewish National Fund conference in Dallas? The protest. There was a I don't know, like implied. The Jewish National Fund still exists today. We'll see like how it's been here for over 100 years. Until now, they're still continuing their work to complete their job, essentially, of continuing this process of land theft and ethnic cleansing. And so they had a conference just a few months ago in Dallas, and a group of organizers, including SJP and others, went down to Dallas to join in that protest against that conference. But just to talk about the Jewish National Fund, this was founded in 1901 as a nonprofit organization, and it served as the Zionist organization's financial arm to plan and facilitate the settler colonial project of the Zionist entity on Palestinian land. And so their stated objective, and this is in quotes, it was to acquire any lands, forests, rights of possession, and other rights in the prescribed region of Palestine for the purpose of settling Jews on such lands. So we can see with just this quote that the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, has never shied away from its colonial and genocidal aims to colonize and displace Palestinians. All right, so throughout this new British mandatory period that was started in 1917, and this took place into the 1920s and 1930s, this new organization, the Jewish National Fund, they took an active role in purchasing land from absentee landlords. Now, what does this mean? During the Ottoman Empire, and until it was dissolved in 1916, there were landowners. There were these absentee landowners. They could have been based in Beirut, they could have been based in Istanbul, they could have been based in different areas. And they owned these large swaths of large pieces of land in historic Palestine. And these lands were worked on, and it was lived on by thousands of Palestinian peasants and farmers that worked on that land. And so what the Jewish National Fund did is they went into these lands, they purchased them from these landowners that didn't even live there. They kicked off the thousands of Palestinians that lived there and used that land for to live on and grow on, and this forced thousands of Palestinians off of those lands into just the outskirts of those towns or into other parts of Palestine. So this was already a manifestation of ethnic cleansing and land theft even before the 1947-1948 catastrophe of the Nakba. But after some time, they realized that these smaller land purchases from these absentee landowners would not fulfill their goal of actually establishing a Jewish majority state, because there were just too many Palestinians. And so the only way to fulfill that goal was through violence. They realized that has to be the only way to actually achieve their stated aim. And so they had two tactics that kind of helped them achieve this goal. One of them was through creating what's called a place names committee. This was a committee that kind of looked at the map of Palestine, saw all these villages and towns in Palestine, and they sought to rename each of those towns. Each of those towns probably have Arabic names, so they sought to rename those into other names so that they could erase any sort of history or naming a Palestinian name in those towns. Another tactic they used was something called the village files. This was something that they gathered. They did research on these same villages and towns all across Palestine, and this included detailing who lived in those towns, who resisted against the previous British colonial rule, so that they can give that information later on to these new Zionist militias to go into those towns, to know what to target, who to target, so that they can carry out their ethnic cleansing process. So I would have this quote by one of the directors of the Jewish National Fund. Does anybody in the crowd want to read this volunteer? Nobody wants to see. Okay, all the way in the back.
It should be clear to us that there is no room in Palestine for these two peoples. No development will bring us to our goal of independent nationhood in this small country. Without the Arabs, the land will become wide and spacious for us. With the Arabs, the lands remain sparse and cramped. There is no room here for compromises. The way to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, all of them, except perhaps those from Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the old city of Jerusalem. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. There is no other way.
Thank you for reading. So, this is a very clear quote from one of the directors, and actually, this was one of the founders of this organization, the Jewish National Fund. So you can very clearly see the aim, and not only their proposed goal, but the way they were going to do that. There's no room for compromise. The only way is to transfer the Arabs. And how are you going to transfer a people that are living in the land and want to stay there? The only way is through violence. Through these village files and these different tactics, the Jewish National Fund worked with the new Zionist militias and government to raise and ethnically cleanse Palestinian villages all across Palestine. So we can see that these Jewish National Fund leaders were critical in implementing these policies to kick Palestinians out, expel them, and not only that, but destroy their towns afterwards. So this is an example here. This picture right here. This was an old Palestinian village and town. This used to have homes, infrastructure, all different kinds of buildings there for Palestinians that used to live there. And after the 1947-1948 catastrophe, the Nakba, in which the Jewish National Fund was instrumental in accomplishing, they built and planted these forests on top of these villages to hide their crimes. So this is kind of how it plays into green colonialism, is that they portrayed this image of them contributing to the environment, planting forests and national parks and keeping green or whatever other propaganda they might spew out. But in reality, this is on top of the crimes, on top of the ruins and the graves of thousands of Palestinians. So this is just another graphic, just kind of showing the same thing. This process of greenwashing and planting trees in order to hide their crimes, national parks and all this sort of thing. But in reality, we can see that this resulted in thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being kicked off of their land, not able to use it, and the erasure of their old history and culture that existed in that land. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Hi, Dr. Yepi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Lamont. I go by Ash, she, they pronouns. I'm a member of the Absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. I'm also Oglala and Chichangu Lakota, and I am the co-director of the Department of Sovereignty and Self-Determination at Honor the Earth, which is an international Indigenous rights organization led by Indigenous women from Turtle Island and Palestine. And so I lead the national campaigns, and our main campaign is green colonialism. And on our international side, we partner with the Palestinian Youth Movement, and their main campaign is Mask Off Mursk. And so, yeah, I'm just really excited to get the chance to talk to y'all today a little bit about green colonialism and how it is happening right here, right now, right where you're sitting. And so I think that first slide, just had some of these bullet points. And I think that these are the main takeaways that I just really hope to impart. And if you have more information, definitely, hope that y'all can link up later and just, yeah, keep these conversations going because it really is so crucial. So green colonialism, it's really the new form of settler colonialism. And I feel like y'all gotten that sense from, talking about indigenous rights here in Turtle Island, all the way to what's happening in Palestine, their erasure and replacement of indigenous peoples, and genocide. And so, green colonialism specifically, it's rooted in the so-called green extraction. It impacts the lands and lives of indigenous communities globally. It deadlocks indigenous communities into a non-consensual relationship with industry. And this technology does not benefit communities, nor does it help solve the climate crisis. Rather, it fuels and perpetuates the military industrial complex. And that last point is the most important, along with the through line of settler colonialism, because that's really what I want to get across. And I feel, like this is a good segue from the previous slides. And honestly, that was an amazing graphic. I really would love to check that out later. But I just want to share a quote with y'all from my auntie and well-known Ponca movement elder, Casey Camp Hornak. She said it like this. She said, "They may not be coming after us with their bayonets and their rifles, but they're coming at us with nuclear waste, with fracking, with pipelines, where they're killing my relatives." I think that she would be just fine with me extending this quote to encapsulate what green colonialism truly is. And so again, I said, our team is tackling this behemoth. And you may hear leaders on all sides of the aisle and all corners of the movement touting the so-called green energy transition. They may be, pushing forward electric vehicles, solar panels, as ways out of the climate crisis. But at Honor the Earth, we believe that really the true way to get out of the climate crisis is through land back and sovereignty for all indigenous peoples across the globe. And so that's really where our root is. And so we push on all of this as a solution to the climate crisis because indigenous lands and communities are still being impacted by mining, extraction, and refining. All of these are necessary for this technology to move forward. And so, just I guess going a little deeper into it, and I know Kesa is going to just drive all of these points home, but I just really want to touch on some of this really quick. Environmental projects, initiatives that are described as conservation or sustainable development, but that instead perpetuate or reinforce colonial power dynamics, these further marginalize indigenous peoples and communities worldwide. And so they're really pushing for the idea that these are green projects, but again, they still involve the extraction of natural resources. They still involve land grabs, and they still involve displacement of indigenous populations. And of course, the imposition of colonial conservation without respecting indigenous knowledge, needs, rights, sovereignty, and free, prior, and informed consent. And so some of the examples of these, and Kesa is really going to talk, more in depth about one of them that's right here, right now. But some of these include large-scale renewable energy projects like hydroelectric dams, wind farms. These displace local indigenous communities and the land and lifeways that they depend on without their consent. Also projects that promote monoculture, plantations for biofuels, or carbon offset programs. These also lead to land grabs and environmental degradation. They also disproportionately impact already targeted communities, and we believe these are false solutions to the climate crisis. So you may gather that in many ways, this fight is actually more difficult precisely because there is so much support for it on all political sides. And I think you can go ahead and flip to these next slides, please. So we're being told again, that minerals like lithium, like cobalt, like nickel, and others are so-called critical because they are necessary to build electric vehicles, solar panels, rechargeable batteries. Some in the environmental justice field are touting these as the solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm here to tell you, we aren't going to drive our way out of this crisis. Rather, we must address the root causes, which include settler colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. What we have also identified, and what these letters here, can just drive home, is that, the reason why so many are reluctant to take this fight on is because these minerals are in fact not being extracted and refined to benefit our communities or save us from the climate crisis. Rather, they are being refined, mined, and extracted to fuel and perpetuate the military-industrial complex, which obviously causes great harm to Indigenous peoples worldwide. And as you'll hear next, this is a major reason why Westwind Elements sought, Lawton, Oklahoma, which is home to Fort Sill. And so, I'll just end here and tell you that sovereignty and land back are the answers to all of this. Indigenous peoples here in Turtle Island and Palestine. On behalf of all life, we must combat all forms of green colonialism. And again, to underscore my point and to segue to my sister Kesa, this technology being guised as critical minerals or the green energy transition is not being mined, extracted, or refined to help our communities or to get us out of the climate crisis. Rather, this technology is being mined, extracted, and refined on Indigenous lands without our consent in order to fuel and perpetuate the military-industrial complex, which causes widespread devastation and destruction to Indigenous peoples worldwide, from Turtle Island to Palestine. And then, Kesa, please drive that point home and tell them about those letters.
Hey, Ashley, we lost audio for a second. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. Word. So yeah, I guess, for the people on the Zoom that can still hear me, I just want to, tell you a little bit about these letters. So one is from to the Department of Defense, and the other is to the Department of Energy. And it's from our Republican leadership here in the state of Oklahoma. And basically what it's saying is that building this refinery that they're trying to build in Lawton, Oklahoma is necessary for the military industrial complex, that these minerals will be necessary to fuel the military. And so, I just, think that, that's the way I wanted to draw those connections and in there and segue over to Kesa.
Okay, so while I'm figuring it out, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Kesa. I'm an absentee Shawnee in Kiowa. I am the coalition coordinator for Western Resistance. And so we are a grassroots Indigenous and federal-led organization. We are essentially fighting the first cobalt nickel manganese and other critical mineral refinery that's being built in the United States. It's currently being built in what's called Lawton. This was also the ancestral lands of the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, and honestly a lot of other tribes. Oh yeah. I really like going on over there, so what I have right here in this bottle, this is a mystery liquid for you all. I started to put like 4 things in there, but as I started putting things in there, I realized that it really wasn't stable. So I decided to just do one thing. It hasn't really been approved by the FDA, the EPA, or any other regulating body. It's definitely the first of its kind. Is anybody willing to drink it? No? There's some trepidation? So that trepidation is why we at Western Resistance exist. This is the very first cobalt refinery that's being built. The only regulating body at this moment would be at the state level, so that would be the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. If you know anything about the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, then you know that they don't really exist to be proactive. So their job isn't really to ensure that things don't go wrong. Their job is to show up when something does and to try to prevent it from happening again. So our city, Lawton, they essentially work together, and I wouldn't say that I guess I don't know that I can say that they intentionally pulled the wool over our eyes. What I can say is that, in my opinion, there was some deceptive processes that were going on there. So essentially what they did was they approved this huge plan called the Capital Improvement Plan. And so that essentially exists because every city has these huge capital improvements that can only really happen if you have a influx of money. And so what they did is in like projects, but they just like put like categories. So deep within the capital improvements plan, one of the categories that they put in there was industrial development. So none of us really knew, because I'm not gonna lie to you, the city council meetings are long as and they're boring. So we really didn't see it, like when it was happening, we just knew that there was this entity that was coming in. They also didn't tell us Westwood and what its name from the beginning. Instead, they hid behind the moniker, the Blue Gray Park Project. So they didn't really tell us like what they were doing or who it was. They just told us that there was this business that was coming in. When they brought Westwood in, Westwood was partnered with a company called CDMR. And so they were essentially like, they're a Canadian-based metallurgy technology company. And basically what happened is Westwood's huge stick is like, America, Earth, we're the best, everything here, wrong. And so CNPR was the one who had all of the experience within the field. They owned all of the patents for the technology. So the machinery that's being used to refine these raw materials has to be built by somebody. Like somebody's going to figure out how it happens. And so CVMR was allegedly that guy. Like, I mean, they were that world. Like, they had it all. And so Katie was like, okay, let's figure it out. Let's partner up. So when they came here, they were partnered up with CVMR. So they at least had an entity that had experience behind them. Now they don't have that, and they are in fact suing CVMR for fraud. So Kaylee Long is the CEO of Westwood, and she essentially, this is like her first time ever like having any sort of business within the refinement field or within the metallurgy field. I personally feel like she knew that our city was gonna get duped and that it was gonna be easy to take money from us because our city is kind of old school. Think like very small town. Like when our former mayor went out to explain what Westwood does, he told us, well, they're just gonna put dirt in and you're gonna get dirt out. And you can put that dirt anywhere. Not exactly what they do. So our city, like part of why we're fighting against this is because infrastructurally our city is just not built up to withhold a refinery of this scale. So we have like an industrial zone, and none of the industrial zones within that, none of the companies within that industrial zone are required to do fence line monitoring. They're actually not required to do any sort of air emissions reporting. It's all like self-reported. So it's like, if you want to, like if you want to tell us what's coming off of your property, that's fine. If not, that's cool too. The roads that are leading up to the refinery are all gravel. And so any sort of raw material that's being brought in would have to be brought in on a gravel road, which I don't know if you have ever driven on a gravel road, but that would essentially be the equivalent of an 18 or 24-wheeler doing this. So not exactly the safest. Just infrastructure-wise, like our wastewater system is not set up to be able to take in the amount of water that would be outputted off of the refinery of that size. There's a cultural aspect to it for us. So I told you that I'm absentee in Kiowa. And so on my absentee side, I'm a direct descendant of Chief Tecumseh. On my Kiowa side, I'm a direct descendant of Chief Seikainde. So Seikainde actually represented our people at the Medicine Lodge Treaty. And within that Medicine Lodge Treaty, it actually names the lands that we're on now. Well, it won't, not now. But it names those lands to be used for agricultural development. And so for me, personally, I take that personally. Because my ancestors had a vision for how to care for this land. We don't really view ourselves as like owners of the land. We really view ourselves as like stewards. So they had this idea, this vision of how we could provide for our families with generations to come. And what our city is doing is going like the direct opposite of that. The other part of that is that within a quarter of a mile, there is the Deo Mission Church, which was essentially the first church that was given to the Spanish Asian people. And so we have a lot of like our relatives that are buried there, and a lot of them are military, so they're vets, and the parents have like ceremonies that they do with their relatives. And so if something were to happen at Westwood, that would essentially deem the lands around it as bio-waste, that would include our relatives that are buried within the lands at Deo Mission. So there's honestly, like, I could really go on and on about why we're fighting against this refinery. But I'll go ahead and answer the one question that I know you all have right now, which is, what the hell does this have to do with Palestine? So, I will tell you. In our city, Lawton, we have Westwood, which is located on the west side of town. So our city is actually built to expand from east to west because you can't go north because there's a military base, Fort Sill. So Fort Sill is actually the country's largest artillery base. And then on the east side of town, we have FISTA Innovation Park. And so essentially what FISTA does is they act as like a third party. So if there's defense contractors that aren't necessarily in the military, then essentially they'll go through FISTA. And so what they've done is they have created a delta, essentially a triangle, of defense contracting, and they're trying to essentially make it to where everything defense-wise is happening here in the United States. And so what we are seeing is that there is this pattern of the government extracting raw materials and committing atrocities from indigenous lands and against indigenous people. They are then bringing the materials to get refined while simultaneously, again, committing atrocities against indigenous people. They're bringing that material to be refined on our land, and then that, essentially, that refined material is what is going to be used in weapons, bombs, tanks, planes, all of those things which are then essentially being used to commit atrocities against the Palestinian people. So what we are seeing is actually a cycle of settler colonialism and militarism that is being used to override sovereignty across the world. That's it. That's all I got.
So I'm just going to expand a little more on what Kesa and Ashley have presented there for us. So I'm going to talk a little more about Washington's critical mineral agenda, its connection to militarism, and specifically Oklahoma's place, and all of that. So as Ashley and Kesa mentioned, Western Elements is part of a larger push by the U.S. government to bring critical mineral refining to the U.S. Currently, China is the main global exporter of many critical minerals and rare elements, and we get much more supply from them. So why are we so interested in shifting our supply away from China and to the US? Well, capitalists see nothing but untapped potential in mineral resources of the earth. Why let all those resources continue to sit in the ground when they could be accumulating them more profit? So also China having such a large share of the market of such a lucrative global export also is unacceptable to American corporate interests. They want to, they see all of that as basically just money sitting on the table that is not being hoarded by them, and they need it. So they are trying to own as much of the earth as they can. And so they are doing this thing that they have done before in the Middle East. We see a very similar situation play out with the oil reserves of the Middle East. So the world was transitioning to oil as its primary energy source years after the Second World War. And so, of course, once again, Western capitalists are seeing all of this global resource, all the money that can be made from it, and they must take it, get their greedy little hands all over it, and make as much money as they can and dominate it as much as they can. We see a similar thing happening here now with critical minerals. So another interesting part of the critical minerals agenda is the greenwashing that we see surrounding it. So even conservative think tanks, when they talk about this issue, they talk about how China is causing all this environmental damage with their critical minerals industry, and that's all part of their argument for independence on China for critical minerals and bring it to the US. And of course, they conveniently lead out of the narrative how we would avoid the same pitfalls of environmental damage that they claim China is causing. So this appeal to environmentalism serves simply as a way to continue the colonial practice of plundering the earth for its raw materials in order to accumulate more wealth. They are co-opting environmentalist rhetoric when it serves their own interests against China, but they ignore the same concerns when it comes to this extractive industry here. And this is very close to home. So, Kate's already talked a bit about how critical mineral extraction translates to increased wealth for U.S. government and capitalists. So I'll just kind of reiterate here, all around the narrative, whenever you read about critical minerals, you see these phrases, defense supply chains and national security. So whenever you see words and phrases like that, all that means is we want to plunder the earth and do more war and colonial violence. So that should always be a red flag when you see Washington and corporate executives saying things like that. So I'll give a specific example of nickel, which is defined by Western Elements. The Department of Defense describes nickel as an essential mineral input to produce high-temperature aerospace alloys, stainless steel, and chemicals for lithium-ion batteries. So you can see there's a lot that goes into making the bombs, making the drones, all the surveillance systems, missiles, aircrafts, everything like that, that is used to destabilize other countries, and most recently to commit genocide against Palestinians. So all of this, of course, refining nickel here basically just serves to facilitate the profit growth of the defense industry, which only translates more violence and plunder here around the world, as we have already talked about. So Western Elements is not the only connection that Oklahoma has to the military industrial complex. Palliser, Oklahoma has been called Bombville as it is where America's biggest non-nuclear bombs are built at the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant. And this plant alone is about half the size of Gaza, sitting at 70 square miles. This plant is for the main site of production of the MK-84, which is a 2,000-pound bomb, larger than even the heaviest bombs that the U.S. dropped in Iraq. These are used in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, you know. So these have been used dozens of times in war crimes, and they leave craters that are 50 feet wide and more than 3 stories deep. To cite a specific example that Responsive State Track reported on October 17, 2023, after the Israeli military told Gazans to flee the Khan Yunis for their safety, it bombed the Al-Lamdani family house in Khan Yunis. Between 15 and 40 people were killed in the attack, and remnants of a U.S.-made MK-84 2,000-pound bomb were found at the site. Now, we can't 100% say that this bomb was made of McAllister, but McAllister being one of the main sites of fulfillment for that type of bomb, you can draw your own conclusions. So, in addition to this McAllister munitions plant and Western Elements in Lawton, Case already mentioned there is the Force Military Base and the Fires Innovation Science and Technology Accelerator, or FISTA Innovation Park, which basically serves to strengthen the Fort Sill military base in Lawton and the U.S. military in general, all the while allowing Oklahoma politicians to boast about innovation, military benefits, job creation for Oklahomans. So they are painting all this as great for the community when, as Kate explained, it's actually detrimental to especially local tribal communities, and slowly starts to prop up the military industrial complex and further strengthen Oklahoma's role in all of that. So these are just images of the ammunition plant, this stuff, and then this is starting that the education tech bombs are moving to build in California. So, in the wake of all of this, and defensive history, boasting about their huge profits, our politicians are filling their pockets. So many of our local politicians own shares in the top companies that are in the military industrial complex, with Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, which have all profited hugely since the start of the Military Plaza. For example, Raytheon, the makers of the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that turned most of the into rubble, and are currently being dropped inside of one of these crackers. Saw its full return for investors in the past year reached 82.69%, outperforming the S&P 500 by about 46%. So huge returns for defense contractors and those who invest in death and destruction that these defense contractors cause. So specifically, we have Senator Mark Mullen bought shares and Representative Kevin Byrd bought shares of Raytheon just before October 7th. And also purchased Lockheed Martin shares over the summer, and in return, these investments have made those representatives thousands of dollars over the last several months. These same politicians also get quite a bit from the federal tax. So just to cite some of the main examples of the biggest representatives who are getting funding from federal tax. For the federal tax, we got Nolan once again. He got in last year, the 2024 cycle, almost $90,000 from the American National Affairs Committee, also known as APAC. Tom Cole got over $500,000 from the very same APAC. And James Langford, another senator, he got over $167,000 just last year from the Pro-Israel America. So, as you can see, all of these interests are very much aligned to bolster the defense contractors, these executives, and our political elites. They all benefit from about what the local tribal communities have to say about what's being done on their land, or how this is affecting indigenous people around the world. So, I want y'all to think about today. There's connections, and start by talking about the history, and it's mentioned that ethnic cleansing is an ongoing process. Genocide is an ongoing process. We like to think of these things as in the past, but as you can see, there are things happening right now, as we have talked about, that are simply continuations of this violent colonial history. So, Diana and I are going to say the concluding words, and then we'll tell you about ways that you can take action against the issues of research. Right? Yeah.
All right. So I hope we've created an effective learning center that will be sustaining your minds for the coming future. Now is the time to get into what you can possibly do to help our causes. So right here we have the list of organizations that help make today possible, and you can join it here. We have the Oklahoma City USA chapter. We have Western Resistance, Oklahomans Against Occupation, and our beloved American Indian Movement Indian Territory chapter that helps out today as well. Shout out to all of you because they paid for the pizza that we all got to eat today. So shout out to them. Also here is a list of external boards to learn about. They are doing the Lord's work, especially Palestine Red Crescent Society, Doctors Without Borders, and huge shout out to the Revolutionary Maoist Coalition as well. They did tremendous work assisting us get this going as well. Right. And then also we need to show some support to Western Resistance. They have some upcoming teach-ins on 6th, 13th, and 20th next month in Mon, Oklahoma. Huge shout out to them. They did travel a long way to be here today to teach y'all some things. So. If you can, they do need some help with fundraising for legal assessment and some other legal fees as well. There should be QR codes everywhere, and then we'll show a QR code whenever everyone's meeting up together again. So let's go ahead and okay. So we tried our best to go through with the BPS list as well to get into it. Essentially, it is an organization that maps out companies and products that are heavy hitters in the support for the apartheid state of Israel and their ongoing genocide in Gaza. Here's a list. OAO also has a bunch of resources over there at their table as well if you guys want to take some home. It goes a little bit more in depth. Now, I did want to thank y'all for everyone in attendance and in person and virtually for coming today. We hope that you'll leave with a little bit more knowledge and hopefully your empathetic capacity has greatly increased. We'd also like to see your hope increase as well. Although the near future is uncertain, we do have each other to rely on. We do have a few last messages to share. I do want to bring up a story that I got to be a part of on the 100th anniversary of the Black Wall Street Massacre here on Own State. Wise old comrade outside of Nappy Roots explained to a crowd of hungry organizers, I was lucky enough to be there, that the sheriff of Tulsa County deputized the white reactionaries in order to enact the atrocity on the Black population. He said that we must heed the words of Brother Malcolm Shabazz, and we must win freedom by any means necessary. And that we must meet and exceed the forces of the reaction to our own. He told us, just like the sheriff that day, he was deputizing every single one of us to continue the work. Now, we may not use the same terminology as deputy or even sheriff. However, we in the DSA OKC chapter, Western Resistance, Oklahoma's Anti-Occupation, and American Indian Movement, Indian Territory, are calling on everyone in the room, on the live stream, if you watch this later at home, to do the same. We call on you to continue the work our martyrs have left for us, to fight against imperialism, to fight against colonialism, to fight against any injustice brought to any of our communities in order to fight for a better world. Not just for less, not just for the indigenous buried in unmarked graves, but also for the Palestinians who were robbed of this life on this earth. We will not make their sacrifice go in vain. I cannot speak for everyone in this room, but I know for a fact my comrades and I will answer this call. Now we leave the ball in your court. Will you do the same? Thank you.
So just want to really emphasize the fight in Lawton against Western elements. They want to use the defense industry, which is going to hurt indigenous people here and in Palestine. And Western resistance is the part of the fight against that. So we got a donation link for their Cash App. This is going towards legal fees for helping them in their fight against resistance. And then I also want to acknowledge that the fight for Palestinian liberation is not over. So there's all series of news like ceasefire. We celebrate that, but the IDF is still present in Gaza, and they have increased their attacks in the West Bank, and they're continuing to violate the ceasefire in Gaza. Our goal is the end of Israeli apartheid, dismantling of settlements on Palestinian land, the end of the siege on Gaza, for Palestinians to be afforded their right of return and self-determination. So, the fight's not over until Palestine is free. So, get organized, build community, make sure you're boycotting. If you want more information, if you want to talk with us after this about what that means and how you can figure that out, what more you can do to organize it. We've got tables back there with also with these QR codes, and then we're free to talk as well. So yeah, feel free to stick around, and we'll talk about our link tree on the right. That one's for volunteering for organizing state application. this one for West Resistance, and then here there are links in our link tree with more organizations that are helping Palestinians right now. Yes, so if you're looking to donate and help Palestinians, so there's some links in there on this link tree. So yes, just want to make everybody aware of that. That is all we have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And yes, hope you have a great rest of your night.